Night of June 5, 1944, and the rain had stopped an hour before, but the air still carried the smell of wet earth and diesel. Somewhere south of Caen, in the half-light of a Normandy night, 4 silhouettes crouched beside an abandoned farmhouse. The youngest, barely 20, checked his watch again and whispered that they had 25 minutes. Outside, the wind rustled the wheat, and in the distance a German garrison of 50 men stood watch near the rail line. Beyond that line, a train was due before dawn, a string of cars carrying ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements destined for the north and the beaches. None of the 4 knew the exact hour of the invasion, but the coded message on the BBC had been clear: the long sobs of the violins of autumn, and that was enough. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Their leader, Henry Delmas, was 43, a farmer before the war who had lost his land, who had seen his son deported and his wife die of illness, and what drove him now was duty rather than revenge. Beside him knelt Luc Morel, a former mechanic from Rouen who moved with the careful confidence of someone who had fixed engines and could make metal obey. André Vasseur, a university student with shaking hands and brave eyes, and Claire Lemoyne, the courier who had slipped through checkpoints dressed as a milkmaid more times than she could count. They had exactly 25 minutes to reach the rail, plant the charges, and vanish before the guard changed shifts. Henri unfolded a rough map drawn in pencil and pointed to the culvert where Luc and he would approach. André would set the charges on the southern track, and Claire would keep watch from the ridge, ready to warn them at the first sign of trouble. Claire hesitated and asked what would happen if they were caught, and Henri met her eyes and said that she would at least be able to tell them they had tried. They moved through the orchard in silence, boots sinking in wet soil, hearts beating louder than their footsteps. Each breath counted like a prayer. A dog barked in the distance and then stopped, and the garrison lights glowed faintly through the fog like arrogant lanterns. Every resistance mission felt like a coin toss between courage and death, and Henri carried with him the memory of his son's voice on a secret radio months before, when the boy had said, "Do not give up, Papa," ever, and that kept him steady. They reached the culvert, the steel of the rail shimmering in the moonlight, and Luc knelt to unpack the explosives, 2 small battered satchels made from stolen German munitions and sugar from the local distillery. André's hands shook as he connected the detonator wire and asked how much time remained, and Henri answered that they had 18 minutes. Henri thought of the beaches to the north, of tiny boats and of men who would step onto sand under fire, and he measured the mission in minutes that might become a gulf between life and death. Luc worked with the quiet expertise of a mechanic, and his practiced hands steadied André as they set the charges. The choreography of sabotage drilled into them in basements and barns. A sentry's lamp swept the rails, and Claire's body tightened, and for a heartbeat the light passed harmlessly before returning to track the field like a slow, patient eye. A truck idled by the garrison and voices spoke in clipped German, while the harmonica warbled and then stopped, making sound both ally and enemy. Henri counted silently. The count was not for show, but for survival. Each minute a coin they could not afford to lose. A crow cawed on a fence post and shadows shifted, and Henri crept closer to André and clasped his shoulder and told him to finish quietly. André's breath clouded in the cold, his lips blue, and he bent lower to press the detonator until he felt the mechanism click into fate. They began to pull back, and the hedgerow swallowed them, the field seeming to exhale and grant them a brief grace. But fortune was brittle, and boots that should not have been there crunched the lane. A flashlight slipped and tapped the dark, and a German voice barked, "Halt," and the world inverted as flares blossomed overhead and turned the wheat into silver blades. Gunfire cracked, sharp and animal, and bullets tore at leaves while Luc shoved André into a fold of hedge, and Claire tumbled, palms torn on splinters. The night filled with the scent of spent powder and wet wool, and light painted them like confessions as the Germans advanced with measured, terrible steps. Henri's mind narrowed to a precise geometry of distance and fuse length and bridge weakness, and he ripped the safety from the detonator and forced fear away by thinking of leverage and ruin. Claire cupped the detonator box between ribs of the hedge and thumbed the safety aside and screamed Henri's name with brittle urgency, and the fuse, set, began to do its work. The explosion was not glamour but brutality. Steel screamed, earth buckled, and the rail tore open like a wound as a truck flipped, and cargo of fuel blossomed into flame that licked the low clouds. The sound rolled across the valley as if the earth itself had been struck, and for a long suspended moment the world balanced between before and after. When the smoke thinned, they counted the cost, and André lay pale, blood staining his leg where a Mauser had found him, and Luke checked his pulse with hands that would not stop trembling. Claire pressed a damp cloth to the wound and whispered anything that might soften the edges of pain while the train would not move for hours, and the bridge and track were wrecked beyond quick repair. They watched the horizon and saw ships glinting like a promise as the armada moved toward the shore, and the hours they had bought turned into a tide for others to ride. Henri sat in the field as dawn bled into grain and thought of his son and the 6 words that had been a compass through darkness, counting breaths and small mercies of survival, while the war carried on indifferent and enormous. Later, when the reports were written and the maps redrawn, the delay would be measured in a single word and a number, but in mud and wood and bone it had been measured in hands and the burned taste of a night that changed destinies. In a hangar far away, the captured Thunderbolt waited under lights, a different kind of prize, and German engineers would later call its 50 caliber guns unstoppable after careful testing. But tonight the work on the ground had been about minutes and courage, and a detonator held between 2 hands. Henri rose and brushed mud from his knees and helped Luke lift André, and together they found the small dignity of moving, of surviving, of carrying the wounded away from the wreck and into the shadow of the hedgerow, where the world felt hollow and honest. They walked toward a future that was not promised, and toward a morning that smelled of smoke and sea, and the fragile hope that other men, in other boats, would make the shore hold. The field kept its secrets in the long years that followed, and the hedgerow healed over the scars left by steel and fire, and when Henri returned decades later, he would trace the rough wooden cross he had carved for his friend, and remember the exactness of sacrifice. At the edge of the track, a plaque would one day name them, and the world would read and pass on. But for that night, the work of ordinary hands, the turning of a detonator, and the will to act, had shifted a tide and bent history toward something like freedom. It mattered. At the garrison, laughter echoed through the night air as German soldiers played cards, their voices rising and falling between the crack of a beer bottle and the lonely hum of a harmonica. They believed Normandy was quiet tonight. The radio had promised calm, and their officers were convinced the Allies would strike at Calais. The deception had worked. The false signals, the wooden gliders, the staged paratrooper drops, all of it, lulled them into the comfort of certainty. They did not know that, only a few miles away, 4 members of the French resistance were moving like shadows toward the railway line that fed the enemy's war machine. The fields were heavy with dew, the scent of damp hay mixing with the faint aroma of engine oil and fear. Above them, the clouds thinned just enough for the moon to cast a pale shimmer over the tracks, and every sound felt too loud, the rustle of grass, the faint clink of a buckle, the whisper of breath. Claire Lemoyne crouched low on the ridge, binoculars pressed to her face. Her fingers trembled, not from fear but from the cold that crept into her gloves. Through the lenses, she saw movement by the rail lamp 2 sentries, rifles slung carelessly, talking as they walked their patrol. She swallowed hard, then raised her signal flashlight and tapped it twice in quick succession. The tiny flash blinked through the dark, barely visible, but to Henri Delmas, crouched near the culvert, it was as bright as a gunshot. It was the warning. Henri froze mid-breath. The guards were closer than expected. Their plan had been timed to the second, but now the seconds were slipping away. He turned to Luc Morel, whose broad shoulders hunched over the charge bag, and whispered, "Luc, we cannot wait. Set the charge now." Luc looked up with that crooked grin that always surfaced when the moment turned dangerous. "Just like fixing a tractor, eh?" he murmured, his voice rough with humor and tension. He worked quickly, tightening the clamps with a mechanic's sure touch, his breath fogging in the cold air. The fuse clicked into place. "Done," he said softly, lifting his head. Henri nodded once. "Then we run." But before they could move, a voice shattered the silence, a sharp German shout cutting through the night. "Halt!" For an instant, time froze. Then came the hiss and pop of a flare shooting into the sky, bursting overhead in a blinding bloom of white. The dark fields turned to daylight. Every blade of grass, every trembling hand, every terrified face was exposed beneath the flare's cruel glow. "Go!" Henri roared, his voice breaking the paralysis. The four scattered like startled birds, diving into the hedgerow as bullets snapped through the leaves. The sharp bark of Mausers echoed across the valley, their muzzle flashes like lightning against the night. Dirt and bark exploded around them. Claire threw herself flat, the detonator box clutched to her chest. The acrid smell of gunpowder filled her lungs. She pushed herself up and sprinted down the ridge, her boots slipping in the wet grass. "Henri, the line's armed," she shouted over the roar of gunfire. Her voice barely carried above the storm. Henri turned to look, his heart pounding, and saw André Vasseur lying in the open. The young man had been hit. Blood darkened the fabric of his trousers as he dragged himself toward the ditch, one hand clawing at the dirt. "André!" Henri shouted, but before he could move, Luc was already running back. He reached André, grabbed him by the collar, and hauled him into the cover of the hedgerow. "Leave me!" André gasped, his face pale, his teeth clenched against the pain. "Not tonight," Luc growled, his jaw set with the stubbornness that had made him both impossible and indispensable. The Germans were advancing now, shouting orders in clipped tones, their boots pounding the field. 5 of them at first, then 10, their shadows long in the headlights of a truck that had turned toward the noise. The beam swept across the field like a blade of light, catching movement, catching fear. Henri ducked lower, counting seconds in his head. They had no time. Every step the Germans took was a beat closer to capture, to interrogation, to the end of everything. He could see the outline of Claire on the ridge, clutching the detonator. She hesitated, frozen by the sight of her comrades still trapped in the field. Henri's voice cut through the chaos, raw and commanding. "Claire, the detonator now!" She shook her head, tears streaking the soot on her face. "But you are still there!" she shouted. Henri's reply came like thunder. "Now!" It was not anger, it was necessity. His voice carried all the weight of duty, of love for his country, of every promise made to the dead and the living. Claire's fingers hovered over the trigger. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then she pressed it. The explosion ripped through the night like the voice of judgment. The ground convulsed, the rail line erupted in a plume of fire and twisted steel. The shockwave knocked the nearest soldiers off their feet, their shouts lost beneath the roar of destruction. The air filled with the scream of tearing metal and the deep, hollow thud of pressure collapsing earth. The truck's headlights shattered as its chassis flipped, flames blooming from its ruptured tank. Smoke billowed upward, thick and black, blotting out the stars. Henri hit the ground hard, the breath torn from his lungs. His ears rang, the world reduced to a high-pitched whine. Dust and ash drifted down like snow. He turned his head and saw Luc still shielding André with his body, both covered in dirt. Claire stumbled down the slope toward them, her face ghost-white in the firelight. The rail was gone. The track lay twisted like the ribs of a broken beast, the wooden sleepers splintered and burning. Henri dragged himself to his knees, coughing, eyes stinging. The Germans were in chaos. Some shouted orders, others scrambled for cover, and a few simply stared in disbelief. Henri seized the moment. "Move!" he shouted. Luc slung André's arm over his shoulder and began half-dragging, half-carrying him toward the hedgerow. Claire followed, her breath coming in ragged bursts, clutching the detonator box like a relic. Behind them, ammunition in the overturned truck began to cook off. Each detonation smaller but sharper than the last, a staccato punctuation to their escape. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs threatened to give way. They threw themselves into a drainage ditch, panting, hearts hammering in the darkness. The smell of mud and blood and smoke mixed into something almost unbearable. Henry peered over the edge of the ditch and saw the fire spreading across the rail yard. Sparks drifted upward, fading into the fog. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed the alarm spreading from post to post, calling for reinforcements that would come too late. Henri turned to his team. André was pale, his breath shallow but steady. Luc tore a strip from his own sleeve and tied it tight around André's thigh to slow the bleeding. Claire knelt beside them, her face streaked with soot, eyes wide but alive. "You did it," Luc said quietly, his voice rough with exhaustion. "The track's gone. They cannot move supplies to the coast." Henri looked toward the burning rail and allowed himself a brief nod. "Then the night was worth it," he said softly. For a long moment, none of them spoke. The only sounds were the distant crackle of fire and the low moan of wind through the ruined track. The flare smoke still drifted, glowing faintly in the light of the flames. They knew they could not stay. Patrols would be sweeping the area within minutes. Henri glanced at his watch, the face cracked but still ticking. 5 minutes, maybe less, he murmured. "We move through the orchard and into the woods. We do not look back." Luc lifted André again, and together they rose. Claire helped guide them through the narrow ditch, keeping low, her mind still echoing with the explosion. As they disappeared into the orchard, the sound of engines began to rumble behind them, reinforcements arriving too late to stop what had already been set in motion. The night that had begun with laughter and cards had ended in fire and ruin. The Germans had been fooled again, but this time not by fake signals or decoys. This time, they had been fooled by 4 people who refused to yield, who had turned courage into sabotage and silence into thunder. As the last flare sputtered out and the valley fell back into darkness, Henri looked once over his shoulder at the burning line and whispered a single word under his breath: France. He turned away, and the 4 vanished into the black folds of the forest, leaving behind only smoke, broken steel, and the echo of defiance carried on the wind. The ground lifted beneath them. A thunderclap of fire and steel tore through the night, shaking the earth like the wrath of some unseen god. The railway split open like a wound rails twisted, wooden ties flung high into the air, the sound of ruptured metal echoing for miles across the valley. A German truck swerved violently, its headlights slicing the smoke before it crashed into the embankment, flames licking greedily at its tires. Henri's ears rang as he lifted his head from the mud. His face was smeared with soot. His lungs burned from the acrid stench of cordite and diesel. He could see Luc dragging André through the wet grass, their bodies silhouetted against the firelight. Claire stumbled toward them, clutching her side, her breath sharp and ragged. The night smelled of gunpowder and burning fuel, the air vibrating with the aftershock of their defiance. In the distance, faint but unmistakable, church bells began to ring. No one had ordered them. It was Caen, waking up to chaos. The resistance had struck its blow, and the message was clear. The invasion had begun. Henri stared at the burning wreck and whispered, "For France." Miles away, deep in the heart of Germany, the world was quieter, though the war's hum was ever present. Inside a secured Luftwaffe testing facility, floodlights blazed over a captured American fighter. Its paint still bore the faded white star on blue, its serial number hastily crossed out and replaced with a German code, T9 plus FK. To the engineers of the Circus Rosarius, the Luftwaffe's secret evaluation unit for captured enemy aircraft, it was more than a curiosity. It was a revelation. The P-47 Thunderbolt sat massive and silent, its radial engine looming like a fortress of steel and oil. Its wings carried 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns, 4 on each side, still stained faintly from combat. The Germans circled the aircraft with reverent disbelief. They were accustomed to their own designs, the sleek Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the agile Focke-Wulf 190, machines of elegance and speed. But this was something entirely different. Oberingenieur Karl Riedel, a senior Luftwaffe engineer of 47 years, walked slowly along, the fuselage, his gloved hand tracing the thick aluminum skin. "Look at this," he muttered. "It's built like a tank, heavier than our bombers, yet it climbs." His assistant, a thin man of 26 named Dieter, scribbled notes feverishly on a clipboard. "Sir, the Americans use a turbo supercharger in the rear fuselage. It forces compressed air into the engine, giving it power even above 20,000 feet." Riedel nodded, his expression half admiring, half bitter. "Clever devils. Our pilots would sell their souls for an engine that doesn't choke at altitude." They opened the cowling. Inside, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial gleamed with brutal simplicity. Where German aircraft relied on precision tuning and delicate maintenance, the Thunderbolt favored brute endurance. It could take hits, lose cylinders, and still fly home. One engineer later wrote in his report, "The American fighter appears engineered for the long war for a pilot to live through mistakes, not merely avoid them." Nearby, a Luftwaffe test pilot named Hauptmann Otto Reinhardt, 32 years old and twice decorated, circled the aircraft with a skeptical grin. "A flying brick," he said. "Too big, too heavy. I doubt it could outturn a Stuka." Riedel gave a faint smile. "Maybe not, but it does not need to. Watch." 2 days later, under a grey German sky, Reinhardt climbed into the cockpit of the captured P-47. The controls felt alien American dials, thick handles, switches marked in English, but the layout was practical, almost comforting. When he started the engine, the ground trembled. The roar of the double Wasp filled the airfield like thunder. Mechanics covered their ears, shouting to each other as Reinhardt taxied down the strip. He pushed the throttle forward, and the beast came alive. The acceleration surprised him, the heavy frame surged with power. As the wheels lifted off the ground, the Thunderbolt climbed, steadily, almost defiantly, into the clouds. At 3,000 meters, he tested the roll. Sluggish, yes, but steady. At 5,000 meters, he tested the dive. The air screamed past the canopy, but the wings held firm. When he landed 40 minutes later, his face was pale. Riedel approached him. "Well, Herr Hauptmann?" Reinhardt took off his goggles slowly. "It's unstoppable," he said at last. "Not beautiful, not agile, but unstoppable. I shot the guns. 8 Brownings. It feels like the sky itself tears open." The engineers gathered around the test logs that evening, reading Reinhardt's evaluation with growing unease. He described how the P-47 could dive faster than any German fighter without disintegrating, how its rugged armor and self-sealing fuel tanks made it nearly immune to small-caliber hits, how its firepower 8 synchronized machine guns, each spitting hundreds of rounds per minute, could shred a train, a truck, or another plane in seconds. One technician wrote in the margins of his report, "If our pilots meet this in numbers, they will need angels, not luck." The captured Thunderbolt became a silent teacher to its unwilling hosts. The Germans dismantled sections of its fuselage, studying how American engineers layered the armor, reinforced the spars, and designed quick-release panels for field maintenance. They were astonished to discover that a damaged gun on the Thunderbolt could be replaced in half an hour. On the Focke-Wulf, the same repair might take half a day. Even the cockpit layout impressed them, everything within reach, no clutter, no over-engineering. It was a machine built for one purpose: survival through fire. Weeks passed. Reports of Allied air superiority grew by the day. P-47s escorted bombers deep into German territory, tearing apart anything that dared to climb against them. Reinhardt, reading intelligence updates, shook his head in disbelief. "So many of them," he whispered. "Hundreds." One evening, as Allied bombers thundered overhead, Riedel stood beside the captured P-47 in the hangar. The lights flickered as the ground quaked from distant explosions. He touched the cold metal once more, a gesture half respectful, half mournful. "You were made to end us," he said quietly. In a notebook found years later, Riedel's last entry read, "We tested the American Thunderbolt. We thought it crude, until we saw what it could do. It endures where ours fail. It is the machine of a nation that builds not for grace, but for power." Meanwhile, back in Normandy, Henri and his surviving comrades crouched in a ruined barn as dawn painted the horizon. The explosion had crippled the supply train, and the German garrison near Caen was in chaos. Claire wrapped André's wounded leg with strips torn from her dress. Luc, exhausted but alive, leaned against a shattered beam, watching the smoke rise from the rail line. "Do you think it mattered?" André asked weakly. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Henri looked toward the distant clouds. In the growing light, faint contrails streaked across the morning sky, dozens of them, weaving silver paths toward the coast. "It mattered," he said. "They're coming." Moments later, the rumble of engines reached them, a low, rolling thunder that grew louder with each passing second. They stepped outside, shielding their eyes. High above, a formation of Allied fighters roared overhead, sunlight glinting off their wings. Among them, unmistakable, flew the same type of aircraft that the Germans had called unstoppable, the P-47 Thunderbolt. Claire smiled through her tears. "They're ours," she whispered. Henri nodded. "Yes," he said softly, "and they bring the storm." The planes disappeared toward the horizon, their echoes fading into the distance. The war was far from over, but in that moment, in the muddy fields of Normandy and the silent hangars of Germany, the truth was the same. The Thunderbolt was more than a machine. It was a symbol of persistence, of courage forged in steel. And for those who had seen it, whether resistance fighter or Luftwaffe engineer, it carried one undeniable message. Some forces, once unleashed, could not be stopped. At dawn, the air over the German testing field shimmered with mist and exhaust. The first light of day crept over the hangars, revealing the dark silhouette of a captured P-47 Thunderbolt, now wearing the black cross of the Luftwaffe. The massive fighter stood like a caged beast, its polished propeller glinting under the pale sun. Inside the cockpit, Hauptmann Otto Reinhardt adjusted his leather gloves, his breath fogging the canopy glass. He was 32 years old, one of the Luftwaffe's most trusted test pilots, and today he would fly the enemy's machine. Below, engineers in grey uniforms moved with quiet precision. Clipboards in hand, they scribbled calculations and murmured in clipped tones, their eyes darting between the American aircraft and the rising thermometer. The air smelled faintly of fuel, metal, and morning dew. One officer shouted, "All clear." Reinhardt nodded, flicked the magneto switch, and pressed the starter. The engine coughed once, then roared to life. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp filled the field with a deep, thunderous growl that vibrated through the ground. Even the German engineers, accustomed to their own Daimler-Benz engines, looked up in admiration. "It sounds like a locomotive," one of them muttered. The massive propeller blurred into motion, sending a rush of wind that rippled the flags nearby. Reinhardt performed his final checks: oil pressure, temperature, control surfaces. Everything responded with mechanical perfection. The Americans, he realized, had built something extraordinary. He pushed the throttle forward, the radial engine's growl turning into a roar as the aircraft began to roll down the runway. Gravel and dust scattered beneath the tail. The takeoff run was longer than he expected, the sheer weight of the machine pressing down. But then, almost imperceptibly, the Thunderbolt lifted, rising steadily into the pale grey sky. From the ground, the Luftwaffe engineers watched in silence as the captured fighter climbed, its wings glinting silver against the morning light. "Mark the time," Riedel ordered. A stopwatch clicked. "We'll measure its climb to 10,000 feet." The aircraft rose with surprising vigor, not the sluggish climb they had anticipated. "Despite being twice the weight of our Messerschmitt," one engineer said, "it climbs faster than I imagined." At 5,000 feet, Reinhardt adjusted the mixture and trim. The controls were heavy but predictable. The Thunderbolt didn't dance in the air, it powered through it. He pushed higher, to 10,000, then 15. The turbo supercharger in the rear fuselage whined like a siren, feeding compressed air into the engine. At 25,000 feet, he still had power to spare. Reinhardt smiled behind his mask. Incredible. Our fighters gasp for air at this height, but this one still breathes like it's at sea level. Below, the technicians stared at their instruments. Power retention at altitude is remarkable, Dieter noted. Our Bf-109s lose over 20% performance at this ceiling. This one barely drops 10. Another engineer murmured, the Americans built their warplane for the stratosphere. Ours are trapped near the clouds. Next came the dive test. Reinhardt nosed the Thunderbolt down gently, then steeper. The airspeed indicator began to spin 300, 400, 500 miles per hour. The aircraft shuddered slightly, but its frame held, firm. German planes, especially the early Messerschmitts, often suffered from compressibility issues in high-speed dives, the control surfaces locking, the wings screaming in protest. But not this machine. Reinhardt leveled out with ease, the G-forces pressing him deep into his seat. He laughed aloud in disbelief. It dives like a falcon but lands like a bear, he said into his radio. The frame does not twist, it endures. His voice crackled over the loudspeakers on the ground. Engineers scribbled furiously. Riedel looked at the data and shook his head. They have mastered strength over beauty, he said softly. And it works. The final trial was the armament test. Reinhardt brought the plane low over the firing range, where wooden targets had been erected along a stretch of field. Each wing of the P-47 carried 4.50 caliber Browning machine guns, 8 in total, an arsenal unmatched in any single-engine fighter of the war. When Reinhardt pressed the trigger, the world erupted. A torrent of fire burst from the wings, a sound like tearing thunder. The recoil shook the aircraft, but it held steady. Empty shells rained down like brass rain, glinting in the morning light. The engineers below ducked instinctively as the rounds walked across the target line, wood splintering, sandbags exploding, dirt flying into the air. 13 pounds of lead every second, shouted one of the German officers over the noise. Mein Gott, it's a flying artillery piece. Another covered his ears, shouting, no fighter in the Reich can match this. The range was a storm of metal and smoke, the echoes rolling across the airfield long after Reinhardt had released the trigger. He circled once more and radioed in. If you face one of these, he said dryly, you cannot run and you cannot hide. Its 8.50 guns make a wall of fire in seconds. When he landed, the aircraft taxied to a stop and the engine fell, silent. Reinhardt climbed down from the cockpit, removing his helmet. His expression was unreadable, part awe, part dread. Riedel approached, clipboard in hand. Well, Hauptmann? Reinhardt exhaled slowly. It is not a fighter, he said. It is a monster. The Americans built it not for elegance, but for war without compromise. That night, in the dim light of the workshop, the German engineers compiled their findings. Their notes spoke of admiration cloaked in technical language, superior engine performance, unmatched firepower, durable construction, rapid maintenance design. One report concluded, against such a machine, the Luftwaffe must rely not on strength but on strategy. Its endurance and firepower outmatch ours at every altitude. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, in the battered countryside of Normandy, Henri Delmas and his comrades were still hiding in the ruins of a barn. The smell of smoke hung in the air, but so did hope. Their mission, the destruction of the rail line near Caen, had succeeded. The German reinforcements had not moved. The train, loaded with ammunition and fuel, never reached its destination. Henri sat against a broken beam, his rifle across his knees. Luc and Claire tended to André's wound, now bound tight with a strip of cloth. The morning light crept through the cracks in the walls, and in the distance, They could hear something faint but unmistakable, the distant rumble of thunder. But it was not thunder. It was the sound of engines. Hundreds of them. Claire rose, shading her eyes toward the horizon. "What is that?" she whispered. Henri stepped outside. The sky above the fields shimmered with motion aircraft, dozens upon dozens of them, their wings catching the sun. The Allied armada had arrived. At 6:30 that morning, June 6, 1944, the invasion of Normandy began. Across the beaches, landing craft surged through the waves, the sky alive with fighters and bombers. And among those, aircraft, slicing through the clouds, flew the same machine that the German engineers had called unstoppable the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. Henri felt the tremor of their engines in his chest. "It's begun," he said quietly. Claire nodded, tears streaking her dusty cheeks. "Then we've done our part," she said. Above them, a flight of thunderbolts roared past, diving toward the coast. The same guns that Reinhardt had tested, the same 8.50 Brownings, now unleashed their fury upon German positions. The wall of fire he had described became the hammer of liberation. Back in Germany, Riedel stood by the hangar door, reading the last lines of his report. Outside, the sirens wailed as bombers approached. He set the paper down and looked once more at the captured Thunderbolt, its nose still gleaming under the lamps. "You were the storm we could not stop," he murmured. Then the lights flickered as distant explosions rolled across the night. In Normandy, Henri and his companions watched the sky blaze with tracers. Every flash, every rumble, was proof that the tide had turned. The P-47 was no longer a test subject in a German hangar. It was freedom with wings. The war had entered a new and bitter phase. The thunder of Allied bombers rolled daily across the skies of Europe, and German cities trembled beneath the rain of fire. Inside dimly lit offices of the Luftwaffe's technical command, engineers gathered to review their findings. The captured P-47 Thunderbolt sat silent in a hangar outside Augsburg, its American markings painted over with the Black Cross, its wings folded like the arms of a giant at rest. The air smelled of oil, ink, and cigarette smoke as the men of Zirkus Rosarius prepared their final report. Oberingenieur Karl Riedel, his eyes weary from endless nights of study, adjusted his spectacles and began dictating to his assistant. "The P-47 is not flawless," he said. "It is heavy, less agile in tight turns than our Bf-109. It consumes more fuel and lacks efficiency in low-altitude engagements." He paused, tapping the pen against the desk. "However," he continued, "it can dive faster, climb higher, absorb far more damage, and deliver firepower that we cannot match at this time." The room was silent except for the scratching of pens. Outside, the faint rumble of distant bombers could be heard, an echo of the very machines they were studying. Riedel exhaled and leaned back. "Send the report to Berlin," he said quietly. "Let them decide what to make of it." When the findings reached Luftwaffe High Command, the reaction was mixed. Some officers dismissed the conclusions, unwilling to accept that a single-engine Allied fighter could outlast the pride of German engineering. Others, particularly the veterans who had fought over France, recognized the truth. The Thunderbolt was not beautiful, but it was deadly. It was not swift, but it was relentless. To better understand their enemy, the Zirkus Rosarius unit was ordered to take the captured Thunderbolt on tour across various German airfields. Pilots were invited to see it, touch it, and if trusted enough, fly it. The goal was simple: learn how to fight it, how to defeat it, how to survive against it. At one such airfield near Bremen, a crowd of young pilots gathered around the captured P-47. The aircraft gleamed under the sun, its massive frame dwarfing the slender German fighters beside it. Reinhardt, the same test pilot who had first flown it weeks earlier, stood before them. He pointed to the 8 gaping barrels on the wings and said, "This is what you must fear most. These guns make a wall of fire. Once you are caught in that field, you are lost." A young flyer raised his hand. "Then how do we defeat it, Herr Hauptmann?" Reinhardt smiled grimly. "You don't," he said. You avoid it. Attack from above, from surprise. Never turn with it. Never dive against it. Pray it does not see you first. The laughter that followed was nervous, forced. Everyone understood the weight of his words. The thunderbolt had become more than a machine. It was a force of nature, a storm that swallowed those who dared to face it head-on. Back in Normandy, the war's tide was visibly turning. The fields, once scarred by German occupation, now trembled beneath the boots of Allied soldiers. Henri Delmas returned to his orchard, the one he had not seen green in years. His boots were caked in mud, his hands blackened from soot, but his heart felt lighter than it had since the war began. Luc walked beside him, supporting André, whose leg was bound tight in bandages. Claire trailed a few paces behind, her hair unkempt, her eyes both weary and bright. The four stood among the twisted remains of the old farmhouse, watching smoke rise from the distant coast. "It's quiet," Luc said softly. "Too quiet." Henri looked toward the cod, the horizon. "For the first time," he said, "that's a good thing." They had survived the night that changed everything. The train that was meant to resupply the German divisions never arrived. The enemy's lines had faltered. The invasion had broken through the beaches. For the first time in 4 long years, freedom had gained a foothold on French soil. In Germany, word of the Allied advance spread like wildfire. Factories worked in panic, shifting production to meet impossible demands. Fuel was scarce, morale was cracking. Amid the chaos, engineers like Riedel and his men continued their work, not out of hope for victory, but out of duty to record what was slipping away. One memorandum circulated quietly through the halls of the Luftwaffe's research division. Its opening line read, "We conclude that the Americans do not merely build fighters, they build tanks with wings." The phrase spread quickly, repeated in workshops from Berlin to Munich, whispered by pilots before takeoff, muttered by mechanics who stared at the sky as Allied fighters prowled overhead. The phrase captured a grim truth. The German war machine, once unmatched in precision and power, was faltering. The skies no longer belonged to the Reich. The Allied bombers came by day and by night, escorted by swarms of Thunderbolts and Mustangs. Each mission the Germans launched came at greater cost, each loss harder to replace. At the testing facility, Riedel stood beside the P-47 one final time. The aircraft bore new scars from the repeated test flights, but it remained defiant, its thick armor dented yet unbroken. "You were not meant to be beautiful," he murmured. "You were meant to endure." His assistant, Dieter, looked up from his notes. "Do you think they'll ever build something better than this?" he asked. Riedel shook his head. "Maybe," he said softly, "but not in this war." Through France, German units, retreating or surrendering. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was now outnumbered, outgunned, and outmaneuvered. The P-47 had played a quiet but decisive role, escorting bombers, striking rail lines, and protecting ground troops as they pushed eastward. In Normandy, Henri's orchard began to bloom again. The war was still raging, but for the first time, the sound of Allied aircraft brought not fear, but hope. Claire tended to André's wound, while Luc scavenged for food and supplies. One afternoon, as they rested beneath the old apple tree, Henri pulled a rusted radio from his pack. The signal crackled, and a voice spoke in English, then French. Caen liberated. Allied forces advancing toward Paris. The words hung in the air like sunlight breaking through clouds. Henri smiled faintly. "We've waited 4 years for that sentence," he said. Claire looked at him and replied, "Then let's make sure it's never taken back." Far away, Riedel received his final orders. The testing of captured Allied aircraft was to cease. Resources were to be redirected to jet development, the desperate hope that the new Me-262 could reverse the tide. But deep down, Riedel knew it was too late. The war's outcome was written in the skies, in the relentless hum of the Thunderbolt's engine. He wrote one last note in his logbook before sealing it away. The P-47 represents a kind of warfare that Germany can no longer sustain, a war of endurance, not elegance, of industry, not art. It is the hammer that ends the anvil. Months later, when Allied troops overran the test fields, they found the abandoned Thunderbolt still intact, its propeller rusted, its tires half buried in mud. An American pilot who inspected it laughed and said, "Even captured, she survived." The war's reckoning had come full circle. In France, the orchard was green again. In Germany, the factories fell silent. And in the sky, the roar of the Thunderbolt faded into history, a sound of victory forged through persistence. Henri stood once more among the apple trees, the scent of blossoms mixing with the lingering smoke of war. He thought of all they had lost and of what they had reclaimed. "We built nothing like their machines," he said quietly, "but we had the same heart." Claire smiled faintly. "And maybe that's why we're still standing." High above, unseen but eternal, the echoes of the Thunderbolt drifted across the horizon, a reminder that even in the darkest of wars, endurance could become redemption. Years later, in the summer of 1964, an aging German engineer stood before a restored P-47 Thunderbolt, displayed inside a quiet aviation museum. The hall was bright, filled with echoes of schoolchildren's laughter and the faint hum of air conditioning, but for him, time seemed to stand still. He approached the polished gun cowl, its metal gleaming under the light, the 8 half-inch barrels perfectly aligned. His hand, trembling with age, rested against the cold steel. "We once laughed at it," he murmured softly in accented English. "But our laughter died when we saw the wall of bullets it could deliver." His reflection shimmered in the metal, and for a moment he saw himself young again, helmet on, clipboard in hand, watching test flights under the grey skies of 1944. Far away, in France, Henri Delmas stood in the same field where everything had changed 2 decades earlier. The war had ended long ago, but the memories remained unshakable and alive. He was older now, his face lined with years of work and worry, his hair touched by silver. The tracks that once carried German trains had been rebuilt, and the wheat grew high again, swaying in the gentle spring wind. By the edge of the field stood a small plaque, weathered yet proud, engraved with a simple dedication, "For those who held the line." Henri knelt beside it and brushed away a layer of dust. His fingers traced each name carefully. Luc, André, fallen, Claire, and then, at the very bottom, his own. He looked up at the sky, now a soft blue, quiet and at peace. The same sky that had once roared with the thunder of engines now carried only the hum of distant tractors and the songs of birds. Henri smiled faintly. "They said the 8.50 calibers were unstoppable," he said to no one in particular. "Tonight, I believe they were right." The wind carried his words across the field, whispering through the wheat like the memory of propellers. Because when an aircraft carries such firepower, when it dives faster than its rivals, climbs higher than its pursuers, and refuses to die even after being torn by shrapnel, then its legend becomes more than metal. Its guns speak a language of velocity and resolve. The engineers must admit it, the enemy must respect it, and the world must never forget it. The spring of 1940 had once smelled of oil, smoke, and fear. The French sky, once a gentle blue of peace, had become a ceiling of thunder. Each hour, sirens wailed across small towns from Calais to Reims. Children had looked upward, pointing to silver streaks cutting through the clouds, not knowing if salvation or destruction followed behind. But for the men who built the Thunderbolt, and for those who fought against it, a new truth had emerged. You do not defeat something unstoppable by standing still. You overcome it by adapting, by learning, by daring to rise again when the world tells you not to. And through that struggle, through every scream of engine, every burst of fire, every name etched into bronze history bends. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.